Um, yeah, hi, I'm Louise. First of all, thank you for having me on to speak. The speech has been really brilliant tonight so far. So, yeah, tonight I'm going to talk about my experience of receiving an autism diagnosis at a young age and how that's affected me. So, for a girl my age, growing up in the late 2000s, I was actually diagnosed early enough, like at the age of 10. This came after several years of assessment, so it did take a while. Overall, I'd say this diagnosis was a very positive thing for me, but it took me a long time to realize that. So when I read or even hear about adults getting their diagnosis, I've noticed that for them, the diagnosis tends to be an end to a journey. So they get their diagnosis, and everything about them and their lives makes sense, and they can begin loving themselves and learning the various skills they need to navigate the world on their own terms. But when you're younger, getting a diagnosis is not the end of a journey, because when you're diagnosed at a young age, there's different effects because you haven't had the same amount of life experience. So when my parents sat me down to tell me that I was autistic, I didn't feel relieved. Instead, I burst into tears because my limited understanding of disability that I picked up from the media and from society was overwhelmingly negative, and all I could think of was that this was a bad thing. So when adults get diagnosed, they tend to have put a lot of thought into it and heavily researched it. They know what's coming, they know all about autism. So they know plenty about it. And from reading those different accounts and hearing all those voices, they realize that there is nothing to be ashamed of and that being autistic is not a negative thing. So at that time, I did not have those autistic voices in my life. And though I had a lot of support from my parents, I didn't have ac- actually autistic voices around me giving me the message that it wasn't a shameful thing and that everything would be okay. So it really wasn't a moment of relief where my whole life suddenly made sense. Instead, it felt like I had a secret looming over me. And as I grew older and struggled to make friends and cope with school, those negative feelings only intensified to the point where I saw it as something that was holding me back from fully living my life, where I saw autism as an it that was separate from me, because I thought being autistic could only ever be negative. The process of loving and accepting myself came years after my diagnosis, rather than my diagnosis being the starting point. The benefits of the diagnosis ended up becoming apparent years later, as what the diagnosis did was lay the foundation for later growth and acceptance. So, because my diagnosis came so early, the whole loving and accepting myself part came with making autistic friends who not only genuinely cared about me and understood me, but who also introduced me to autistic spaces online where autistic people of all different ages and backgrounds discussed about what it's like to be autistic and, more importantly, why they're often happy and okay with being autistic. But that does not mean that my diagnosis was not important. The role that my diagnosis ended up playing was that it gave me access to the help and supports that I really badly needed at the age of 10. When the time came and I met those people I truly clicked with, thanks to the supports and help that I had the tools that I needed to be able to connect with them and make proper friendships. You see, as a child, a diagnosis tends to have the most benefits in terms of supports as opposed to immediately helping with self acceptance. So, getting a diagnosis allowed my parents to access a range of supports on my behalf, such as a psychologist who I still see regularly, as well as a drama class designed to help with social skills and occupational therapy. So I'm really glad I was able to access these supports as they have all helped me so much. Because of my young age, I can't actually give a lot of information on how the diagnosis process works because my parents just did it all. But what I will say is how they handled it made all the difference to me. So they always fought for my needs with teachers and professionals, and they are also very open about it rather than hiding it all away from me. I've heard that many parents simply don't tell their child about their diagnosis, and from my experience, I think this is an incredibly bad idea. So, what I'd say if you're a parent, you're like, should I tell my child? I'd say no, don't hide the diagnosis from your child. Obviously, parents should wait for an appropriate time to tell their children. Mine told me during my summer holidays when I didn't have school to stress about as well. But yeah, parents should tell their child about it eventually. By hiding it, nothing's achieved. And maybe you don't mean it by hiding it, and I really hope parents don't mean this, but by hiding it, it can give off the implicit message that a disability is a shameful thing that needs to be hidden. And I'm really grateful that my parents were open about it with me because they showed me that they weren't ashamed of me or loved me any less because of my disability. And during those years that I struggled with loving myself, their support was essential, as well as their acceptance of my diagnosis and willingness to access and engage with supports on my behalf. So, yeah, access to the help that I needed ultimately gave me the tools to accept myself and to navigate my life more easily. I often think about the fact that I'd be a very different person today had I not gotten those supports that the diagnosis essentially was a key to. So, to that effect, I must acknowledge that privilege played a part in this process of getting diagnosed because we live in a very unequal world where the wealth is controlled by a small amount of people, and a lot of services in the past 40 years or so have been privatized, including health. And this has a knock on effect on access to supports for autistic people. So, obviously, we are lucky to have a public health system that offers autism diagnosis and services. It's a flawed system, notably with very long waiting lists. My parents could afford to go the private route for getting me diagnosed, and later on for further help after a frustrating experience with the HSE. This is something that many cannot afford to do. It seems that parents are either faced with a long wait with the HSE or expensive prices should they go the private route. I also know that adults cannot get a diagnosis through public services, making diagnosis even less accessible the older you get. When I think of how much I struggled as a child and how much support my diagnosis allowed me to access, I become acutely aware of others in the same position that I was, whose parents cannot afford to skip those long waiting lists to get their child the help they need. So, and I'm aware of how lucky that I am that my life could have been so different had my parents not had that money. And I always find it that it's incredibly unfair that we live in such a society, like in a country where this is the case, where access to services is essentially based on wealth. I hope that one day we live in a country where money is not a factor in how quickly you can access services, that the quality of life for autistic people is not decided by their parents' financial means. Ultimately, getting a diagnosis was good for me, even though it took me many years to realize that. I want to say it did not solve all my problems. I did not magically love myself or just instantly learn all the skills that I needed to navigate life. There was a lot that I had to do for myself once I engaged with these services. But a diagnosis is a starting point. It's a tool that's let me live my life to the fullest. It was the start of my journey, so to speak, to being able to cope with and navigate the world and to loving myself. So sorry if that speech was a bit short. Thank you again for having me on.